Essential interest. The fundamental quality or condition that underlies any surface interest. It is not the topic itself, but the deeper orientation it reflects. For example, a fixation on true crime may reveal an essential interest in freedom. Essential interest is not subjective preference, but structural mirroring. It reveals what the individual is in active relation with in both self and
I wanted to talk a little bit about my news service essential interest while I'm writing about my news service essential interest, and also fleshing out the prologue to my methodology that I was not planning to do at all, but has happened as a result of me writing about my news service essential interest. So I release it as a service this month after nearly a year of developing it into one in private. So I sat down this week basically intending to write more about it because it's the first news service that I have introduced in quite a long time. And, I realized I've done a pretty good job of explaining what it is on my website, but I hadn't really talked about it outside of that, and I'm really excited about it. So as I started writing, though, something else became much clearer. So, essentially I wasn't explaining essential interest anymore. I found myself beginning to articulate my methodology itself to a degree that I hadn't before. So essential interest was kind of like this last puzzle piece to what I now can recognize as the beginning of this very expanded understanding of my own work as a spiritual scientist. And because of that, the relationship between all four, as it stands, of my services has become way more obvious. First, they are not separate services. And that's not something entirely new. I knew that, but definitely not to the degree and to the degree of clarity that I understand it now. They are different stages in a developmental process. So it's a sequence of events, essentially these services in a developmental process. But absolutely everything begins with an extraordinarily simple premise, and that being every human being has a life's work, because every human being has karma. So when I say life's work, I don't mean, and you probably already know this, I don't mean career, I don't mean your passion, I don't mean purpose. Those things can and absolutely do become expressions of it, but that's not what I mean. I mean, to start, that every human being incarnates into an exceptionally particular karmic reality. Whether they recognize it consciously or not, that karmic reality is already organizing and shaping their life. It's organizing what they notice. It's organizing what they're drawn toward. It's organizing the questions, the different iterations of questions that they essentially never stop asking. It's organizing the way that they love people, things. It's organizing the way that they suffer. It's organizing the very way that they perceive the things that they make. And most people live their whole lives experiencing their life's work indirectly. As a matter of fact, most people, I think you might agree with me, live their lives never once identifying with the idea of themselves as an individual having a life's work. And as a spiritual scientist, that's a problem. That's a problem for me because it's not true. So, people encounter recurring interests, certain forms and types of beauty that they're drawn to. Objects are absolutely, should not be excluded from this. They continually return to media, language, relationships, creative impulses, you name it. There's nothing exempt, but all these things are essentially expressions. They're not the organizing principle itself. An essential interest is my term and my methodology for that organizing principle. It is the most singular, fundamental, essential word organizing your life, your interests, your preferences, your relationships, the way that you perceive and interact with language, the way that you perceive and interact with media, the way that you perceive and interact with people, places, objects, the way that you create, the way that you suffer, the way that you love. What I'm getting at is that essential interest is absolutely a matter of supreme orientation. It orients a person toward their life's work in the most essential sense of the word, and very likely for the first time. Once that word is known, an individual can begin consciously walking toward their life's work because they have the organizing principle through which so much of their life already makes sense, essentially. So there's one clarification that's very important. I do not identify an individual's essential interest by interpreting someone's interests. I don't need to know what someone likes. I don't need to know their hobbies. I don't need I don't need an intake form. I could know nothing beyond the person themselves, their name. Essentially, I need permission. And that's really all in order to perceive there's essential interest through spiritual scientific observation. However, when someone requests or books essential interests, I will have them provide essentially whatever number, and this is optional, but number of interests that they'd like to declare, and that serves an entirely different purpose, right? Because once the essential interest has been perceived and articulated and is known by the person, those interests that they have declared become examples. They allow me to demonstrate in real time during the session how that one quality, that one essential interest has already been expressing itself throughout their life. And so one way I've started describing essential interests, heretofore to no one other than myself, is an eye exam. So not EYE, but an eye exam. The moment, just like just like an eye exam, when, what was, very hazy and half-gripped, I would say, begins to become highly clear and coherent. Fuzzy. What was fuzzy becomes clear. What was something that was largely your entire life that was different versions of being guessed at becomes strikingly visible, just like an eye exam. And what was implicit, right? So there's nothing, there's nothing new here. Just like when you go to get an eye exam, you don't get handed new eyes, but you do get, a new lens. And so that's why, you're going to leave the session looking back over your entire life profoundly differently, backwards. But at present, moving forwards, it's going to radically change the way that you look at absolutely everything. Language is going to reorganize, objects, media, relationships, creative work. Not because anything has, and this to me is one of the most exciting parts about it, not because anything has changed, but because you now have this supra-organizing principle through which what was already there, has always been there, has become essentially unified. So that, of course, naturally raises another question, if you haven't already been asking it, and that's why one word? Well, first of all, language is truly where everything began for me. When, when I was a bit older, I was told, by different family members in different ways, but it was all sort of the same message that when I was very young, especially about 6, 7 years old, and, going beyond that, I was kind of a scary child to be around. I was an unnerving child because I held conversations with adults better than most adults that, that they knew, essentially. So, looking back, and which I have been doing quite a bit of that, I don't think that at such a young age I was fascinated, primarily by language as a system. I definitely could not have, articulated this, but I was fascinated by it as something living, right? So, and writing became my absolute first love because of that. So, way before spiritual science, way before being a working psychic, practicing, as an intuitive, language was from the very beginning teaching me how living realities reveal themselves through form, and so the answer to why one word really, it has far less to do with an individual, a person, the person I'm working with, than it does with how now, today, and over the years, how language is experienced, how it presents itself to me when I'm working. So when I'm in a super sensible state, when I am in what I call, and members of my household know, when I'm in prep, language is not something that I experience as, definitions or vocabulary or language, as we relegate and interact with it in a colloquial sense. For example, in my work and even in my writing practice, for example, I've often encountered words in different languages, a good lot of them archaic or dead languages. Point being, I didn't know them until I encountered them when I was in that state. A really great example of this is a very short story I wrote called File Mary that was published in Magazine. You can find a link to that on my website if you'd like to read it. Anyway, I don't think I've ever done this before, but it's exciting to do so. Language, when I'm in a super sensible state, one of the best ways I can articulate it is that it's an environment. It's a living environment. It is a field. It's a living environment. Words, language, they have gesture, they have movement, presence, sensation, felt relationship. Each word though even the word sort of loses its edges when I'm in that state, is far larger, exponentially larger than, inconceivably larger than we ordinarily experience it to be. The closest comparison that I could give is that each word essentially feels like its own world. So not because I, can perceive everything contained within that world, but because I can perceive very acutely the scale of it. So the same way that I am here on earth, I have a sense that the earth contains vastly more than I could ever experience directly, but, I have a sense of the scale of it. I have that same sense with language while I'm working. So with essential interest, at that point of contact with an individual, there is, and this is basically the building block of my term and what I've been working with over the past, several months from a spiritual scientific perspective, there is a singular, essentially most resonant strand of karma. And that strand is intimated as one word. Obviously, this is not because a human being can be reduced to one word, but one word can carry, in the way that I can perceive it, the greatest qualitative resonance. And once that has been experienced, there are truly countless other gestures of language that become available. So a lot of what I do from that point moving forward is about selection. And the way that I navigate that is for another time. But that's why one word is enough to begin. It's, not because it explains everything, but because it organizes everything that follows it, and so, going back to my experience this past week, writing into all of this has clarified for me something else, and that is, I mentioned it before, but my methodology is developmental. To use analogy, which my clients know I love to do, essential interest is the seed. It's the seed in my methodology. It begins the movement. It begins the walking, right? It begins the period in which your point of perception is that of someone who is walking towards their life's work. The responsibility at that stage is tending that seed. There is more tending required at this stage, I recognize now, than any other stage. So living with it, testing it, applying it, doing something with it, experimenting, allowing it to actively, in a very living way, reorganize that perception until, right, as a seed, it breaks ground. When that happens, the sorrow is the sprout in this analogy, right? So something that was previously only potential has become visible and tangible outside of the self. So you're no longer walking toward it, you're looking at it, you're studying it, you are understanding its form. Cymation is another movement entirely. So with cymation, you're no longer, it's very much like the blossom, the flower. You're no longer looking at your life's work from outside of it and around it. You are looking directly into it. And once you've looked directly into it, you can never unsee it. Living work, different again, different movement. Living work is like the fruit. You're no longer moving toward it or looking into it. You are living from it, creating from it, perceiving from it, expressing from it. So here's the thing I've realized. With each of these developmental stages, i.e. services, it's essentially the point of perception that is changing at every stage. And it goes like this: toward, at, into, from. That sequence became extraordinarily clear to me while I was writing about essential interest this week. But there is one question, and this is a new experience for me when it comes to my work with the public as a spiritual scientist. There's one question that remains. When I perceive an essential interest, am I perceiving the enduring, lifelong, qualitative center of an individual's incarnation, or am I perceiving the singular, most resonant strand of karma for a particular developmental period? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. That is a purely methodological question, but my work will answer it. You know, the way that I work with people, which is over years, you know, most of the people that I work with for years, a minimum of 3 years. And my methodology, essentially, it very naturally creates the conditions in order for me to be able to observe whether an individual's essential interest remains constant or it changes over time. So for right now, what I know is this. I know that essential interest is the beginning. It is the start. It's the beginning of a person's conscious relationship with their life's work. It is the seed. I know that seeds require tending. They don't grow because someone understands them. They grow because someone begins living and acting from a relationship to them. Being a person who knows their essential interest is the beginning of everything changing. You'll never look at the things that you love, that you are interested in, things that you make, the questions you ask, the life that you're living, again, without considering this word. And that's where it all begins. So, you know, essential interest is the beginning of the methodology for someone who's encountering my work for the first time. But for those of you, my living workers, for example, who have worked with me through Visaro, Cymation, living work, it isn't the beginning. It is a part of the foundation that can now be identified. You know, it doesn't replace any of the work that came before it, but it does make highly explicit something that has been, what I understand now, implicit throughout my work for years. You know, essentially as the methodology has developed, so has, no shock here, my ability to articulate it. The observation came long before the language. So essential interest is language that I see has finally caught up with me, with something that I've been perceiving for years and years. And looking back, I can see, you know, the way that it has been maturing in me throughout many, many, many sessions, long before I even had the term for it in my methodology. So it's, for people who have been working with me, within my methodology for years, essential interest isn't starting over or really even going back to the beginning, but it is across the board essentially the same. Identifying that supremely organizing principle that has been expressing itself implicitly through everything that we've already explored, it will change the way that previous work can be understood. And, again, I keep coming back to and reflecting, especially during this retrograde, years and years and years of sessions, and the recognition now that this quality essentially has been there. I was perceiving it, but I hadn't differentiated it as its own stage, essentially within the methodology. And that's really what this is. It's not a new direction. It is absolutely a more precise articulation of something that has been present, however, from the beginning. So for someone new, entirely new to me and my work and my method, essential interest is the first conscious step toward their life's work. For someone who's already, very deep into the work, it becomes an opportunity to recognize and interact from that seed from which so much of that work has already grown. So it's not earlier, though it is absolutely more foundational. It doesn't replace Visaro, it doesn't replace Cymation, it doesn't replace living work. The central interests, like the I in Steiner's fourfold organization of the human being, like the I in the way that it transforms the bodies that came before it, physical, etheric, astral. It has the potential to reorganize the way that an individual understands every other part of the methodology. So what what can I say? What can I say? Ultimately, what can I say is that the language has become more precise. And if there is one thing that I know to be true, is that precision absolutely changes perception.